But the asphalt, which should have been the stage for a tragedy, held a surprise. From the shadows of the woods, a white and majestic figure emerged, an albino lion, a creature of legends, with eyes that seemed to see beyond human cruelty, recognized the fragility of that abandoned life. With a powerful leap, the imposing beast landed in the middle of the road, an unexpected guardian. Its roar, deep and ancient, echoed not as a threat to the elderly woman, but as a war cry against the world's indifference. The trucks, previously unstoppable, braked sharply, their engines falling silent before that wild force. Traffic stopped, and with it, the chance for rescue finally opened, a miracle orchestrated by the purest and most instinctive of protections. The roar of the albino lion, a primordial echo that seemed to tear the very fabric of time, silenced the asphalt. It was not merely the sound of a predator, but the voice of an ancestral force, a protest against the indifference that had almost claimed a life. The trucks, once monstrosities of metal and speed, now lay motionless, their engines choked into a stunned silence. The smoke from burning tires still hung in the air, a grey shroud over the scene, but the smell of rubber and diesel was suddenly overwhelmed by the wild scent emanating from the white beast. In that frozen instant, the world seemed to have stopped to witness the impossible. The elderly woman, her body aching and half-hanging from the fence, felt a tremor run through her veins. It wasn't the night's chill, nor the shock of imminent impact, but incomprehension. Her cloudy eyes, fixed on the majestic creature before her, tried to decipher reality. Was it a delusion? Had death come in the form of a wild angel? The lion, with its immaculate coat and amber eyes fixed on the stopped vehicles, made no sound. Its presence was a wall in itself, a silent challenge to logic and cruelty. Far away, inside the hastily departing car, the daughter felt a chilling shiver. She hadn't seen the lion, only the flash of brakes, the screeching sound, and then silence. A silence that, for her, meant the end. A perverse relief mingled with a pang of terror, but the absence of a final impact, of a scream, of anything that would confirm her macabre plan, began to gnaw at her certainty. She peered into the rearview mirror, her heart pounding, the silhouette of the stopped trucks, their red brake lights blinking in the darkness. Something was wrong. The plan was simple, brutal, effective, but the road was stopped. What had happened? An insidious doubt began to creep into her mind, colder than the night air. On the road, the truck drivers, men hardened by years on the highway, were in shock. A lion, an albino lion. In the middle of the road, they had seen everything, but this defied all explanation. The first driver, a veteran with decades of asphalt under his belt, grabbed the radio, his voice choked. "Control, control, we have an animal on the road. Large, white, looks like a lion. Traffic is stopped and there's a person on the fence." His words were mixed with disbelief. The lion, oblivious to human panic and confusion, maintained its guard, its muscles tense, its tail swaying gently, like a pendulum of life and death. It was not a circus animal, nor a hallucination. It was nature in its purest and most relentless form, defending what humanity had discarded. Its eyes, which seemed to absorb the faint light of the night, were a beacon of determination. It would not allow the woman to be run over, not under its watch. The tension in the air was almost palpable. The drivers, some more curious than frightened, began to descend from their cabs, cautiously. Cell phones appeared, their screen lights illuminating incredulous faces. The scene was surreal, a mile-long traffic jam, an albino lion as the focal point, and an elderly woman, on the brink of death, caught on the fence. The news, like a wildfire, began to spread across social media and radio channels. A miracle, an anomaly. a story no one would believe if it weren't being broadcast live. The elderly woman, in her semi-consciousness, felt the ground vibrate. It wasn't the trucks, but the hesitant steps of the men approaching, keeping a respectful distance from the lion. She couldn't see them clearly, but she felt the presence of other humans. A faint, almost imperceptible hope began to sprout in her wounded chest. The lion, her unexpected guardian, had done its part. It had stopped the world. Now it was up to the men to find the courage to approach, to understand the beast's silent message. Traffic came to a complete halt. Cars and more trucks piled up behind the first vehicles, forming an endless line of red lights. Impatient horns began to blare, but soon fell silent before the magnitude of the scene ahead. It was not a common accident nor a road blockage. It was an event. An albino lion, a being of legends, had become the herald of justice, the protector of the helpless. It not only blocked traffic, it forced the world to stop and look. It forced rescue to stop, not just an emergency vehicle, but collective consciousness itself, to recognize the life that lay forgotten. And amidst the chaos and wonder, the fragile life of the elderly woman hung by a thread, now, miraculously, a thread of hope. The silence of the asphalt, imposed by the lion's ancestral roar, was heavier than the noise of 1,000 engines. It was a silence that screamed, that demanded attention. The drivers, previously hurried in their metal bubbles, were now mere spectators, their daily lives suspended by a creature of legends. The morning mist began to dissipate, revealing the scene in cruel and marvelous detail. The albino lion, a white spectre against the grey of the highway, maintained its imposing posture. Its eyes, previously fixed on the trucks, now swept the horizon as if anticipating new threats, or perhaps as if expecting humanity to finally comprehend the gravity of its error. The elderly woman, caught on the fence, felt the morning chill penetrate her bones. Pain was a constant companion, but a new sensation, strange and powerful, began to manifest. Hope. It wasn't a hope of immediate salvation, but the certainty that she was no longer alone, at the mercy of indifference. She felt the gazes, the whispers, the energy of the bodies cautiously approaching. Her cloudy eyes tried to focus, but the image of the lion, so vivid and unreal, dominated her vision. It was her guardian angel, her executioner, her miracle. Far away, the daughter's car cut through the remaining darkness, but the frantic pace of her escape began to give way to growing anguish. The image of the red headlights of the stopped trucks in the rearview mirror wouldn't leave her mind. The silence that followed the screech of brakes was not the silence of death she expected, but a dense silence, laden with interrogation. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. Was the plan, so meticulously orchestrated in her sick mind, failing? The idea that her mother might have survived, that fate or some greater force had intervened, was more terrifying than the guilt she tried to bury. Cold sweat trickled down her forehead. She needed to know, she needed to confirm. On the highway, curiosity began to overcome fear. The drivers, initially shocked, now transformed into a hesitant crowd. Some, braver or more reckless, began filming with their cell phones, the screen lights creating small points of light in the gloom. The news spread like wildfire. Albino lion stops traffic and saves woman. Virtual headlines were already forming, distorting reality, turning tragedy into spectacle. But at the center of it all, the elderly woman still hung, a cruel reminder of human fragility and the brutality of abandonment. The first driver to get out of his truck, a burly man with a grizzled beard, tried to communicate with emergency dispatch. His voice, previously choked, was now a mix of urgency and perplexity. "We're at mile marker 127 of the highway. Yes, a lion. White. And there's a woman caught on the fence. Looks like she was hit, but the lion is protecting her. No one can get close." The words echoed over the radio, met with disbelief on the other end of the line. "A lion, sir? Are you sure? Couldn't it be a large dog?" The operator's voice was skeptical, but the desperation in the driver's tone was undeniable. The lion, as if understanding human hesitation, let out a low, guttural growl. It wasn't a full roar, but a warning, a reminder of its wild nature. The few who had approached a little closer immediately backed away, panic replacing curiosity. The beast was not there to be filmed, nor to be admired. It was there to protect, and its presence was an insurmountable barrier, a challenge to the very notion of rescue. How could one approach a victim under the guard of a predator? The elderly woman, feeling the growl vibrate in the air, felt a chill. The lion was her savior, but also a constant threat. Her eyes, now more accustomed to the gloom, could distinguish the forms of the men backing away. She was saved from being run over, but she was still trapped, injured, and now, under the watchful eye of a beast, no one dared challenge. Time stretched on, each second an eternity of pain and uncertainty. Meanwhile, the news reached the ears of the highway patrol. Initially, it was treated as a prank, a bad joke. But the multiple reports, the photos and videos that began to emerge on social media, forced a reassessment. A team was dispatched, along with the fire department and, more reluctantly, a wildlife control team. The situation was unprecedented, dangerous, and required coordination rarely needed for a simple traffic accident. The daughter, unable to contain her anxiety, did the unthinkable. She turned the car around, doubt gnawed at her. The need to see, to confirm, was stronger than the instinct to flee. She needed to be sure the plan had been completed, or that it had failed spectacularly. The fear of being discovered, of being seen returning to the crime scene, was immense, but the terror of the unknown was even greater. She drove back, her heart pounding in her chest, her hands sweaty on the steering wheel. Each mile driven toward the traffic jam was a step toward the precipice. On the highway, the crowd grew, but the distance between the humans and the elderly woman with the lion remained. Emergency lights began to appear on the horizon, blue and red flashes tearing through the pre-dawn darkness. The sound of sirens, still distant, brought a promise of order, of intervention. But the question hung in the air: how would they deal with the unexpected guardian? The lion, sensing the approach of emergency vehicles, raised its head. Its amber eyes gleamed with renewed intensity. Its mission was not yet over. It had stopped the world, but now it needed to ensure that the rescue was, in fact, a rescue and not a new threat. The tension was almost unbearable, a tight knot between life and death, between nature and civilization, all under the watchful eye of an albino lion. The daughter's car tore through the darkness, but no longer in flight. The steering wheel, once a refuge, was now an object pulling her back into the abyss. Each curve, each mile traveled in the opposite direction of her supposed freedom was a hammer striking her conscience. The cold sweat on her forehead was not just from the cabin's heat, but from the terror consuming her. What would she expect to find? The silence of death, the confirmation that her brutal act had succeeded, or something worse, something that defied logic and would punish her with the sight of her own failure. Doubt was a spreading poison, more potent than any remorse. The image of the red headlights of the stopped trucks in the rearview mirror wouldn't leave her mind. The silence that followed the screech of brakes was not the silence of death she expected, but a dense silence, laden with interrogation. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. Was the plan so meticulously orchestrated in her sick mind failing? The idea that her mother might have survived, that fate or some greater force had intervened, was more terrifying than the guilt she tried to bury. Cold sweat trickled down her forehead. She needed to know. She needed to confirm. Meanwhile, on the highway, emergency lights began to tear through the pre-dawn darkness. Blue and red flashes pulsed on the horizon, announcing the arrival of civilization, order, law. The sound of sirens, still distant, was a growing lament, a promise of intervention that paradoxically brought both hope and a new kind of apprehension. How would the rescue proceed in the face of such an unexpected and wild guardian? The lion, sensing the approach of the vehicles, raised its head. Its amber eyes gleamed with renewed intensity, as if the light of the sirens fueled its determination. Its mission was not yet over. It had stopped the world. But now it needed to ensure that the rescue was, in fact, a rescue and not a new threat. A low, guttural growl escaped its throat, a primal warning that cut through the air, momentarily muffling the sound of the sirens. The drivers, who had previously gathered in curiosity, retreated again. The arrival of authorities did not diminish the danger, it only made it more official, more palpable. The crowd, now larger, made way for the highway patrol vehicles and ambulances. The emergency vehicles stopped at a safe distance, their lights spinning and painting the scene in ghostly colors. The first officer to step out of the patrol car, an experienced sergeant, had a face etched with disbelief. He had received the call, but reality surpassed any report. There it was, imposing, majestic, an albino lion in the middle of the highway, guarding a woman caught on the fence. It was an image that defied reason, that refused to be categorized in any incident manual. Dispatch confirming, it's a lion, an albino lion, and the victim is caught on the fence, appears seriously injured. The animal is blocking access. I repeat, the animal is blocking access. The sergeant's voice was tense, almost a whisper over the radio. On the other end of the line, initial skepticism had been replaced by stunned silence. The wildlife control team, which had been reluctantly dispatched, arrived shortly after. Its members, accustomed to rescuing snakes from homes or monkeys from urban areas, had never faced anything like this. An adult, wild lion in the middle of a busy highway, protecting a human victim. It was a movie scene, a biological and behavioral anomaly. The elderly woman, in her semi-consciousness, felt the asphalt vibrate. The smell of burning rubber and diesel, the biting cold of the pre-dawn. The flashing lights were a red and blue blur in her cloudy vision. She heard voices, whispers, the deep growl of the lion. Pain was a constant, but hope, previously a thin thread, now strengthened. She was no longer alone. The world had stopped for her. The sergeant attempted a cautious approach, slow steps, hands visible, voice calm. "Hey, big guy. Easy there, friend. We're here to help." The words seemed ridiculous in the cold pre-dawn air. The lion didn't move, merely fixed its eyes on the officer, a gaze that seemed to penetrate the soul. It was a clear warning. One false move, and wild nature would manifest itself. The tension was almost unbearable. The elderly woman's life hung by a thread, and time was a relentless enemy. The paramedics, helpless, watched the scene, their equipment ready but useless against the feline barrier. How could they stabilize the victim, transport her, without risking their own lives and that of the animal? The situation was a stalemate, a battle of wills between human urgency and animal determination. Far away, but rapidly approaching, the daughter saw the spectacle of lights and stopped vehicles. Her heart hammered in her chest, an erratic rhythm of fear and strange fascination. She slowed down, the car almost crawling, blending into the line of curious onlookers forming. What would she see? What had her act provoked? The morning mist, beginning to dissipate, revealed the scene in cruel and marvelous detail. The albino lion, a white spectre against the grey of the highway, maintained its imposing posture. Its eyes, previously fixed on the trucks, now swept the horizon, as if anticipating new threats, or perhaps as if expecting humanity to finally comprehend the gravity of its error. The daughter parked her car at a safe distance, the engine still running, her hands sweaty on the steering wheel. She couldn't tear her eyes away. The scene was surreal, unbelievable. And there, at the center of it all, was her. Her mother, still caught on the fence, and beside her the lion, the albino lion. The sight hit her like lightning, more potent than any guilt. The plan had failed, and the failure was more monstrous than the crime itself. The sergeant, after a brief communication with the animal control team, made a difficult decision. They couldn't wait any longer. The woman's life was at stake. "We'll try a distraction. I need volunteers to create a perimeter. The containment team will try to sedate the animal, quickly but safely." His voice was firm, but the apprehension was palpable. The elderly woman, sensing the movement and increased tension, tried to open her eyes. The image of the lion, so vivid and unreal, dominated her vision. It was her guardian angel, her executioner, her miracle. And now her protector was about to face a new threat, a threat coming from the very men who were supposed to save her. Time stretched on, each second an eternity of pain and uncertainty, while the daughter watched from afar, paralyzed by the horror of her own creation. The daughter's car engine whispered, a sound muffled by distance and the growing hum of adrenaline in her veins. Her eyes, fixed on the surreal scene ahead, registered every detail with painful clarity. Her mother, a fragile heap of flesh and bones, still caught on the fence. And beside her, the albino lion, a ghostly vision under the rotating lights. It was not the outcome she had planned, the final silence, the absence of traces. It was a spectacle, an aberration screaming her failure to the world. The plan had failed, and the failure was more monstrous than the crime itself. A wave of nausea hit her. It wasn't remorse, not exactly. It was the terror of exposure. The lion, that improbable guardian, had turned her act of desperation into a stage, and she was the invisible architect of all that madness. What would happen now? Flee? Impossible. Her feet seemed nailed to the car floor, her sweaty hands glued to the steering wheel. She was a forced observer of her own ruin, the sight of her mother, so vulnerable, so close to death, and yet so protected by that beast, was a thorn in her soul. A part of her, the darkest part, still wished the lion would fail, that the rescue would be ineffective, that fate would run its course. But another part, one she barely recognized, felt a shiver of dread for what was to come. On the highway, the animal containment team prepared. The men, dressed in khaki uniforms and protective vests, moved with a caution bordering on panic. One of them, with a tranquilizer dart rifle in his hands, trembled slightly. They had never faced a predator of such size, so determined, so mystical. The highway patrol sergeant, radio in hand, coordinated the operation, his voice tense and low, almost a whisper in the cold air. Distraction on the left flank, 3 men. Make noise, but don't get too close. The containment team will position themselves. The 3 officers assigned to the distraction advanced slowly, their steps echoing on the asphalt. One carried a megaphone, another a baton that struck the guardrail with a shrill metallic clang. The lion, until then focused on the emergency vehicles, turned its head. Its amber eyes, which had previously gleamed with cold determination, now showed a flash of irritation. A deep, continuous growl escaped its throat, a sound that made the men instinctively take a step back. The elderly woman, caught on the fence, felt the change in the atmosphere. The lion's growl was different now, more threatening, more protective. She tried to move her head, but pain paralyzed her. Her eyes, half closed, saw the figures approaching, the lights flashing. She knew they would come for the lion. And a wave of dread, stronger than physical pain, invaded her. That animal which had saved her, was now in danger because of her. A strange, almost telepathic connection seemed to form between them. She wanted to scream, to warn, but her voice was only an inaudible whisper. The containment team, taking advantage of the distraction, tried to approach the lion from behind, seeking a clear angle for the dart shot. The dart rifle, a heavy and clumsy object, seemed even more intimidating in the specialist's trembling hands. The pre-dawn wind, however, didn't help, and the darkness, though mitigated by the emergency lights, created deceptive shadows. The lion, however, was no ordinary animal. Its intelligence, its perception, seemed sharpened by a greater purpose. It sensed the approach, a slight movement in the air, a different scent. With surprising agility for its size, it spun around, baring its teeth in a roar that made the ground vibrate. The roar was not just a warning, it was a declaration of war. The distraction men froze, and the containment specialist lost his balance, the rifle pointing skyward. The sergeant, seeing the situation deteriorate, shouted orders over the radio. "Fall back! Don't provoke it! Keep your distance!" But it was too late. The lion, with a powerful leap, covered the distance to the distraction men in a matter of seconds. It was not an attack to kill, but a demonstration of strength, of dominance. It stopped a few feet from them, its claws scratching the asphalt, its body tense, ready to pounce. The officers, pale with fear, raised their hands, their weapons still in their holsters, useless against that force of nature. The daughter, watching everything from the car, felt a shiver run down her spine. The lion was not just an animal, it was an entity, a judge. It stood there, imposing, defying order, law, civilization itself. And she, the cause of all that chaos, was there, witnessing the failure of her plan and the rise of a force she could never have predicted. The terror of being discovered, of having her crime exposed by an albino lion, was almost unbearable. The containment team tried to regroup, but the fear was palpable. Sedating an animal of that size, so agitated, was an almost impossible task. A poorly placed dart could irritate it further, or worse, have no effect, turning the lion into an uncontrolled killing machine. The elderly woman's life, already hanging by a thread, now seemed even further from rescue. The elderly woman, in turn, felt her body grow cold, the pain turning into numbness. But the sight of the lion, so majestic and protective, fighting against the men who were supposed to save her, ignited a small flame of desperation in her chest. She didn't want it to get hurt. It was her miracle, her guardian angel. And now it was in danger. A tear streamed down her face, mixing with blood and dirt. The stalemate was complete. The lion, guardian of life and death, kept everyone at bay. Sirens continued to pulse, lights to spin, but civilization was paralyzed before wild nature. Time was running out, and with each passing second, the elderly woman's life ebbed away, while the daughter in her car watched her own private hell unfold, unable to intervene, unable to flee. The highway, once an escape route, had become a labyrinth of guilt and terror. And at the center of it all, the albino lion, the incarnation of an unpredictable destiny, a guardian no one dared challenge. The sergeant, radio in hand, knew he needed a plan B. But what? And how much time did they have left? The night wore on, and with it, hope diminished. The sergeant, radio in hand, felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. Orders to resolve the situation echoed in his ears. But how? With each passing second, the woman's life ebbed away, and the lion, that white spectre of fury and mystery, kept everyone at bay. The night, which had previously seemed a protective veil, now rapidly dissipated, revealing the first rays of a timid sun on the horizon. With the light, inevitable attention would come. And it came. First, a distant hum, then the unmistakable sound of a helicopter. Next, the lights of news vans flashing frantically as they joined the line of stopped vehicles. Reporters, Microphones in hand and cameras at the ready began to gather, turning the tragedy into a spectacle. The highway, once a stage for an intimate drama, was now a media circus. In the car, the daughter felt an electric shock run through her body. The panic, which had previously been a fog, now materialized into a chilling terror. The cameras, the microphones, the entire world was about to witness the failure of her plan, and by extension, her monstrosity. The lion, her unexpected executioner, had turned her crime into a global event. She was the invisible architect, but with each flash, each lens pointed at the scene. She felt more exposed, more visible. Anonymity, her last refuge, was crumbling. Her fingers trembled on the steering wheel. Flee. The idea was a primal imperative, but her muscles seemed petrified. Where would she go? Where would she hide from a story that would soon be on every news channel? The albino lion, majestic and terrible, was now the center of a narrative she had written, but over which she had lost control. It was not just an animal, it was a judge, a herald, a mirror reflecting the ugliness of her soul to the world. The elderly woman, in turn, felt life drain from her like sand through her fingers. Pain was a constant companion, but the sight of the lion, now illuminated by the growing morning light and the camera flashes, was a strange balm. It was there, her improbable protector, facing not only armed men, but now also the invasion of human curiosity. A new wave of dread hit her, not for herself, but for it. She didn't want it to get hurt. That animal which had saved her from certain death was now in danger because of her. A deep, almost spiritual connection had been established. She tried to move her hand, a useless gesture of warning, of plea. The sergeant, seeing the arrival of the press, knew that time was up for conventional approaches. The pressure was immense. He turned off the radio for a moment, seeking an instant of clarity amidst the chaos. His eyes swept the scene, the dying woman, the imposing lion, the helpless paramedics, the frightened officers, and now the ravenous media. A plan B. He needed something radical, something no one expected. "Attention, everyone," he shouted, his voice hoarse but firm, cutting through the murmuring. "Fall back, all armed men, lower your weapons and holster them. No one approaches. Containment team, put away the darts. We're not going to provoke it. We're going to try a different approach." The officers exchanged glances, confused and apprehensive. Lower their weapons in front of a furious albino lion? It was madness. But the sergeant's voice left no room for discussion. Slowly, reluctantly, the weapons were holstered. The containment team, still trembling, retreated even further. "What do we do, Sergeant?" asked one of the paramedics, his voice laden with despair. "She's dying." The sergeant looked at the lion, which maintained its posture, its eyes fixed on the humans, but now with a new intensity, as if it perceived the change in the atmosphere. "We're going to try to talk," he said, his voice almost a whisper, more to himself than to the others. "We're going to show that we're not a threat, that we're here to help, not to fight." He turned to the paramedic team. "I need one of you, the calmest one. You'll approach slowly, without weapons, without sudden movements. Talk to it, to the woman. Let it see you're not a threat." The paramedic swallowed hard, his face pale. It was suicide, but the sergeant's gaze was one of iron determination. There was no other option. The woman's life depended on it. He nodded, his mouth dry. The daughter in the car watched the scene unfold with growing incredulity. Talk to the lion. Those men had gone mad. But at the same time, a strange hope, a spark of possibility, ignited in her dark chest. If they failed, if the lion attacked them, if chaos ensued, perhaps she could escape unnoticed. Perhaps the lion in its fury would erase all traces of her crime. The paramedic, Arthur, felt his heart pound in his chest like a war drum. Each step was an eternity. The asphalt seemed to stretch infinitely before him. And the lion, Previously a distant figure now grew in his vision, imposing and terrifying. He slowly raised his hands, showing empty palms, a universal gesture of non-threat. "Easy, boy," he murmured, his voice hoarse, more to himself than to the animal. "We're here to help." The camera flashes were like silent lightning, freezing the scene in macabre frames. The helicopter hovered above, its hum a constant reminder of the world's vigilance. The albino lion, in turn, did not move. Its amber eyes, previously flashing with fury, now seemed to assess Arthur with a cold, almost studious curiosity. Its tail, which had previously lashed the air, was now motionless, only the tip trembling slightly. It did not roar, did not growl. It merely watched. A white sphinx in the middle of the highway, guarding its secret and its protected one. Arthur felt a shiver. It wasn't the ferocity that scared him now, but the intelligence, the depth in that gaze that seemed to penetrate his soul, stripping bare his fears and intentions. The elderly woman, her head turned towards the lion, felt Arthur's presence as a distant shadow. Her vision was blurry, but she could distinguish the approaching human figure. A part of her wanted to scream for Arthur to retreat, not to disturb her guardian, but her voice wouldn't come. Pain was a thick fog, and the pre-dawn chill began to seep into her bones, promising eternal sleep. She coughed, a weak, guttural sound, and the lion, as if perceiving her suffering, lowered its head slightly, a subtle movement of concern that Arthur didn't fail to notice. It was an almost human gesture, a confirmation of the inexplicable connection between them. In the car, the daughter watched the scene with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. The sergeant's plan was madness, but a madness that could, ironically, serve her purposes. If the lion attacked, if the situation turned into a bloodbath, attention would shift completely from her mother, from the fence, from her crime. The cameras, then, would focus on the spectacle of wild nature against civilization, and she could disappear in the confusion, a shadow among shadows. But the lion's calmness, the way it observed Arthur, disturbed her. It wasn't acting like an irrational animal. It was thinking. And that was more terrifying than any attack, for it meant the lion was not just a force of nature, but an agent of destiny, and her destiny seemed to be the exposure of her guilt. The reporters, initially skeptical, were now ecstatic. It was the story of the decade, an albino lion, a mystical animal, protecting a dying woman against rescue efforts. The images would go viral, the headlines sensational. The highway guardian lion, the white miracle, nature versus civilization. They shouted questions at the officers, but no one answered, all eyes fixed on Arthur and the lion. The tension was palpable, almost electric, and each second seemed to stretch into an eternity as the world watched, holding its breath. Arthur continued to advance, one step at a time, hands outstretched. He began to speak, his voice low and calm, trying to project an aura of peace. "Hello, friend. I'm Arthur. We don't want to hurt you. We want to help the lady. She's injured. We need to take her to the hospital." He spoke to the lion, but his eyes were fixed on the woman, trying to establish contact, a bridge of trust. He knelt a few feet away, still maintaining distance, but now closer than any other human had come, feeling the warmth of the animal's breath on his face. The lion tilted its head, as if listening, processing the words. A slight tremor ran through its body, but it wasn't aggression. It was almost indecision. It looked at Arthur, then at the woman, then at the stopped trucks, at the fence. Its eyes seemed to weigh the options, the urgency of the situation. The elderly woman, with a superhuman effort, raised her trembling hand, pointing to the lion, then to Arthur, a mute gesture of plea and explanation. She wanted it to understand, to trust, to allow the impossible. Arthur saw the woman's gesture, the pain in her eyes, and the strange connection between her and the lion. He realized that the key was not just to calm the animal, but also the woman. "I understand, ma'am. He's your friend. I promise we won't hurt him. We just want to help you." He slowly moved his hand to the first aid kit on his waist, a movement that could be interpreted as a threat. The lion growled, a low sound, but one that made the ground vibrate, a clear and unmistakable warning. Arthur froze, sweat trickling down his forehead, the cold air in his lungs. The elderly woman, with a last effort of her will, murmured something. It was inaudible to Arthur, but the lion seemed to understand. It looked at the woman, then at Arthur, and the growl ceased. It took a step back, a single step, opening a minuscule space between itself and the woman. It was not an invitation, but neither was it a prohibition. It was a fragile truce, a test of mutual trust. Arthur took a deep breath, his heart still pounding, but a small flame of hope ignited in his chest. It was an immense risk, but it was the only chance. The daughter, in the car, felt a knot in her throat. The lion had retreated. That white monster, her unexpected executioner, was allowing the approach. Her plan of chaos and escape was unraveling, disintegrating under the cruel light of dawn and the camera flashes. Anonymity was fading, replaced by the certainty of imminent exposure. The lion was not a destroyer, but a protector, and now perhaps an enabler of her own condemnation. The irony was cruel, terrifying. She was trapped, witnessing her mother's rescue, orchestrated by a wild animal, under the eyes of the world, and with each passing second, she felt the shackles of guilt tighten on her wrists. The sergeant, observing the scene from afar, felt relief mixed with even greater apprehension. The plan had worked, in part. But the lion was still there, an unpredictable presence, a guardian of borders between worlds. He waved to the paramedic team, indicating they should prepare. The window of opportunity was minuscule, and the woman's life was ebbing away. "Prepare the stretcher and oxygen," he shouted over the radio, his voice firmer now. "But no one moves until Arthur signals, and if the lion reacts, retreat immediately." Fate was in the hands of a paramedic, a dying woman, and an albino lion, on a stage lit by the first rays of the sun and the incessant flashes of the media. Civilization, for a brief moment, had bowed to wild wisdom, and the world waited, in suspense, to see if nature would grant its permission to save a life. The pre-dawn air, once icy, now seemed to burn in Arthur's lungs. The lion's step back was not a retreat, but a concession, a silent ultimatum. That minuscule space, opened between the beast and the woman, was the window of opportunity, a thread of hope so tenuous it threatened to snap with any strong breath. Arthur felt the sergeant's gaze on him, the pressure of the entire world, of the incessant flashes, of the helicopter buzzing like a giant insect. But in that moment, there were only him, the woman, and the lion. He moved his hand, millimeter by millimeter, toward the first aid kit. Every muscle in his body screamed to be quick, to seize the truce. But instinctive wisdom, forged in years of emergencies, whispered caution. The lion was the personification of unpredictability. He could not fail. He could not scare the guardian. His fingers touched the zipper of the bag. The sound, almost inaudible, reverberated in the tense silence. The lion, with calculated slowness, lowered its head, sniffing the air, its amber eyes fixed on Arthur's hand. There was no growl, but the beast's immobility was more threatening than any roar. It was the calm before the storm, the promise of a swift reaction if trust were broken. Arthur, his voice even lower, almost a murmur to the lion, began to speak again. I need to see the lady. She needs help. I'm just going to get some things for her." He opened the zipper, revealing the sterile interior of the kit. With each movement, he watched the lion, looking for any sign of hostility. But the animal merely watched, a white sphinx, mysterious and ancient. The woman, her eyes almost closed, seemed to have entered a state of semi-consciousness. Her breathing was shallow, a weak puff against the cold asphalt. The blood, previously a dark puddle beneath her, now seemed to have dried. But the pallor of her face, her purplish lips, betrayed the loss of life. Arthur knew there was no time. It was now or never. He withdrew an emergency thermal blanket, a portable oxygen tank, and a cervical collar. The lion followed each object with its gaze, as if evaluating the usefulness of each. It was a disturbing intelligence, a comprehension that defied logic. Arthur felt a shiver. It was not an irrational animal he was facing, but an entity that seemed to weigh intentions, to judge actions. With the blanket in hand, Arthur leaned in, a slow and deliberate movement, to cover the woman. He was now mere inches from the lion. He could feel the warmth of the animal's body, the wild, earthy scent. The lion did not move. Its amber eyes, previously flashing with fury, now seemed to carry an ancient melancholy, a resignation. It allowed it. The daughter in the car watched the scene with growing revulsion. The lion, that white monster she had hoped would be her mother's final executioner, was behaving like a nurse. It was allowing the rescue. Every careful gesture from Arthur, every consenting look from the lion, was a hammer blow to her conscience, a nail in the coffin of her escape plan. The fog of adrenaline that had kept her in a state of stupor began to dissipate, revealing the brutal clarity of her situation. She was trapped, not by offense, but by the web of her own guilt, woven under the eyes of the world. The journalist's cameras, previously focused on the spectacle of the beast, now recorded the paramedic's delicacy, the strange complicity between man and animal. The headlines would change. It would no longer be about the furious lion, but about the guardian lion, the miracle of nature, the bridge between worlds. And in the background of every image, every report, would be the figure of the woman and the mystery of how she got there. The daughter's anonymity was disintegrating with every flash. Arthur carefully placed the cervical collar on the woman, stabilizing her neck. She moaned, a weak sound, and the lion, like a concerned parent, lowered its snout, sniffing the elderly woman's grey hair, a gesture of comfort that made Arthur's heart clench. "She's very weak," Arthur murmured to the lion, as if the animal could understand the gravity of the situation. "We need to take her, now." He looked at the lion, seeking permission. Its amber eyes met his, and for an instant, Arthur swore he saw a spark of understanding, of acceptance. The lion, with a slow and majestic movement, took another step back, increasing the space. It was not an invitation for the team, but a signal for Arthur. He had passed the test. The truce was maintained for now. Arthur, his hand trembling, slowly raised it, signaling to the sergeant. It was the signal, the moment to act. The sergeant, who had been watching with bated breath, waved frantically to his team. "Now, stretcher and oxygen, quick but no sudden movements. Keep your distance from the lion." The paramedic team, previously paralyzed by fear, now advanced with renewed determination, carrying the stretcher and equipment. They moved like shadows, their steps muffled by the asphalt, their eyes fixed on the lion, which watched them with an intensity that chilled the blood. The daughter in the car saw the ambulance doors open, the stretcher approaching. The end was near, not the end she had planned, but a far more terrifying end. Revelation. The lion, her unexpected executioner, had become the instrument of her condemnation, a guardian of truth amidst the highway's darkness. Guilt, once a whisper, was now a roar in her ears, echoing the lion's silence. The paramedics, led by a short-haired woman with a concentrated gaze, approached with the stretcher, their movements fluid and synchronized. Each of them seemed to breathe in unison, aware of the imminent danger. The lion, a white statue of vigilance, did not avert its gaze. Its amber eyes followed every step, every inclination. Arthur, positioned between the beast and the team, murmured instructions, more for the lion than for the humans. Slowly. No noise. She needs help. His voice was a thin thread, a mantra of calm in the chaos. The task of detaching the elderly woman from the fence was delicate. The rusty wires had dug into her skin, and each movement caused a faint moan. The lion lowered its head, a guttural sound, escaping its throat, not a growl of threat, but a noise of discomfort, of concern. Arthur felt a shiver. The animal seemed to understand the woman's pain. With the paramedics' help, he managed to loosen the last wires, and the woman, with the cervical collar firmly in place, was carefully rolled onto the stretcher. The relief was almost palpable, but tension still hung in the air. The paramedics lifted the stretcher with extreme caution. The woman, now covered by the thermal blanket and with an oxygen mask on her face, seemed even more fragile. The lion, instead of reacting with aggression, took another step back, opening a clear path to the ambulance. Its eyes, previously flashing, now seemed to carry a strange satisfaction, as if its mission was accomplished. It had protected, had allowed the rescue. Arthur exchanged a look with the paramedic, a look of mutual astonishment and gratitude. They had witnessed the impossible. In the car, the daughter watched the scene unfold with brutal clarity. Her mother was on the stretcher being taken to the ambulance. The lion, the unexpected guardian, had sealed her fate. With each step the paramedics took toward the rescue vehicle, she felt the walls of her freedom crumble. Anonymity, her shield, was in pieces. The journalist's cameras, now focused on the stretcher, captured not only the rescue, but the evidence of a crime. She was no longer the shadow, but the figure who would inevitably be exposed by the light of truth. The roar of guilt in her ears was deafening, an echo of the lion's silence, which remained on the asphalt, a white sentinel watching the ambulance drive away. The stretcher, with the fragile figure of the elderly woman wrapped in the thermal blanket, slides into the ambulance. The metallic sound of the wheels on the asphalt is muffled by the heavy silence that follows. The paramedic, with a last look at Arthur, closes the rear doors. The dry click echoes like a final verdict in the night. The siren, still muted, seems to hold its breath, awaiting the moment to tear through the veil of dawn. The lion, a white and imposing sphinx, remains on the asphalt. Its amber eyes, previously fixed on the injured woman, now turn to the ambulance, following every movement. There is no growl, no threat, only a silent vigilance, a presence that transcends understanding. Arthur, exhausted, but with adrenaline still coursing through his veins, observes the scene. He feels the weight of something extraordinary, something that defies all his experiences. That animal was not just a beast, it was a catalyst, a judge, a guardian. In the car, the daughter feels the air thin. The ambulance doors close, sealing not only her mother's fate, but her own. Anonymity, her shield for so long, shatters into 1,000 pieces under the incessant light of flashes and helicopter spotlights. She sees the sergeant, who was previously focused on the rescue, now gesturing to two officers. Their gazes turn to her car, a chilling premonition that hits her full force. Guilt, once a whisper, is now a deafening roar, echoing the lion's silence. She tries to breathe, but the air feels dense, heavy, laden with condemnation. The perfect plan, executed with calculated coldness, crumbled before a wild miracle. The lion, her unexpected executioner, had become the instrument of her condemnation, a guardian of truth amidst the highway's darkness. The ambulance, with its precious cargo, begins to move slowly, making its way between the stopped vehicles. The siren, still in discreet mode, emits a soft lament, a farewell to the scene of the crime and the miracle. The lion, with a slow and majestic movement, turns its head. Its amber eyes meet the daughter's car. It is a gaze that pierces metal and glass, a silent judgment that makes her tremble. There is no fury, only a deep, almost human understanding of the truth. The daughter feels a shiver that doesn't come from the pre-dawn cold. It is the terror of exposure, of revelation. The lion, with its magnetic presence, had transformed an attempted murder into a spectacle of redemption, and she was the villain at center stage. She swallows hard, her eyes fixed on the officers now approaching her vehicle. There is nowhere to run. The roads are blocked. The world's eyes are on her. Arthur, observing the lion, notices the change in the animal's gaze. The intensity, previously focused on the woman, now turns to the daughter's car. He feels a chill. The lion is not just observing, it is pointing, denouncing. It is a silent, yet undeniable accusation. The sergeant, following the lion's gaze, also perceives the connection. He waves to the officers who quicken their pace toward the vehicle. The daughter, in a last desperate act of denial, tries to start the car. The key turns, the engine sputters but doesn't catch. Panic sets in. She pounds the steering wheel, tears streaming down her face. The plan, the escape, freedom, everything unravels. She is trapped not by the fence, but by the web of her own guilt, woven under the eyes of the world and, ironically, under the vigilance of a beast. The officers reach the car. One of them taps gently on the window. "Ma'am, please step out of the vehicle." The voice is calm, but firm. The daughter looks up, her face disfigured by tears and fear. She looks at the lion, which still watches her, a white sentinel of truth, and for an instant she swears she sees a glimmer of melancholy in the animal's eyes, as if it mourned the darkness she carried. Arthur approaches the sergeant, his mind still trying to process everything. "Sergeant, what was that?" His voice is a whisper of astonishment. The sergeant shakes his head, his eyes fixed on the daughter who is now being removed from the car by the officers. "I don't know, Arthur, but something tells me it wasn't just a rescue. It was a revelation." The daughter is escorted out of the car, her hands cuffed behind her back. The journalist's cameras, previously focused on the lion and the stretcher, now turn to her, capturing every detail of her humiliation. Flashes explode like fireworks in the darkness, illuminating her pale face and her eyes full of despair. The headlines would change. It would no longer be just about the guardian lion, but about the woman who abandoned her mother and the beast that prevented her escape. The lion, as if its mission was finally accomplished, averts its gaze from the daughter. It turns slowly, its tail swaying gently. With slow and deliberate steps, it begins to move away from the highway toward the darkness of the woods. Its white silhouette dissolves into the pre-dawn mist, leaving behind a trail of mystery and an undeniable truth. The highway, once a stage of tragedy and miracle, now prepares for the arrival of justice. And the daughter, alone in her guilt, feels the weight of every gaze, every flash, every silent roar of the lion in her ears. The end she had planned, had been rewritten by a beast and by her own darkness. The handcuffs, cold and relentless, tightened on her wrists, a metal that sealed not only her freedom, but the dignity she had desperately tried to preserve. Each camera flash was a stab, each murmur from the crowd, a hammer striking the anvil of her reputation. She was the villain, exposed under the raw pre-dawn light, a pathetic and unmasked figure, dragged from the car that should have been her escape. The officers led her with professional firmness, their faces impassive, as if accustomed to unraveling the worst secrets of the human soul. But this case was different. The lion's presence, the almost divine intervention, elevated the scene to the level of an urban legend, and she, the daughter, was the dark stain on this narrative of a miracle. She felt the stares burning her skin, the silent judgment of hundreds of eyes that had previously watched the lion with reverence and now gazed at her with revulsion. The ambulance, its siren now blaring, cut through the darkness, carrying her mother away, to safety, to life, and with her the living proof of her cruelty. That sharp sound was a requiem for her freedom, a hymn of triumph for the justice that approached. The daughter tried to look away, but it was impossible. The highway, once the stage for her perfect crime, was now the setting for her public humiliation. Arthur, beside the sergeant, watched the daughter being led away, his eyes, previously fixed on the beast, now divided between the handcuffed woman and the white silhouette that was receding. "Sergeant," Arthur murmured, his voice still tinged with awe, "what will we do about him? The lion." The sergeant shook his head, his eyes fixed on the woods that swallowed the majestic figure. "He did what he had to do, Arthur. His mission is accomplished. No one will approach him now. He is untouchable." The lion, with its silent and deliberate departure, left a void on the highway, but an indelible mark on everyone's minds. It was not just an animal. It was the personification of truth, a herald of wild justice that had manifested to correct a human error. Its departure was as enigmatic as its arrival, a reminder that nature, in its primordial wisdom, sometimes intervenes in the affairs of men in ways that defy logic. The daughter, as she was pushed into the patrol van, cast a last desperate look at the spot where the lion had disappeared. She sought a sign, a roar, anything that could explain the inexplicable, but there was only the silence of the woods, a silence that, for her, was more deafening than any roar. It was the silence of her condemnation, the echo of her guilt. Inside the patrol van, the smell of metal and disinfectant was suffocating. The bars, a cold and impenetrable barrier, were the new limit of her world. She leaned her head against the window, watching the highway chaos diminish as the vehicle drove away. The stopped cars, the flashing lights, the journalists running back and forth, everything became a blur, a distant yet indelible memory. Her meticulously orchestrated plan collapsed before the most improbable of interventions. She had underestimated the power of life, her mother's resilience, and the incalculable force of nature. The lion, that being of wild beauty, had been the unexpected guardian, the instrument of her downfall. It had not attacked her with claws or teeth, but with its mere presence, with its amber gaze that seemed to see through her soul. The headlines, she knew, were already being rewritten. It would no longer be the story of the lion that stopped traffic, but the story of the daughter who abandoned her mother and of the beast that prevented the crime. Her image, captured in 1,000 flashes, would be the face of cruelty, immortalized in collective memory. Anonymity, her shield for so many years, lay in ruins, replaced by infamy. The patrol van accelerated, leaving behind the illuminated highway, the stage of her failure. The darkness of the night swallowed the vehicle, carrying her toward an uncertain but inevitable future. Guilt, once a whisper, was now a deafening roar in her ears, an echo of the lion's silence, which remained in her mind, a white sentinel of truth, a constant reminder that even in the deepest darkness, the light of justice can emerge from the most unexpected places. And she, the daughter, was alone in her darkness, feeling the weight of every gaze, every flash, every silent roar of the lion in her ears. The end she had planned, had been rewritten by a beast and by her own darkness, and the next chapter would be written in the courts of law and conscience. The patrol van, a metal coffin on wheels, cut through the pre-dawn darkness, carrying her away from the stage of her failure. Each jolt was a physical reminder of her new reality, a blow that reverberated in her already fragmented soul. The handcuffs, cold and heavy, were an unbreakable link to the crime she had tried to bury beneath the night's fog. The smell of disinfectant and despair permeated the air, an aroma that from now on would forever be associated with her memory. She leaned her forehead against the cold glass, watching the outside world blur into light and shadow. The journalist's flashes, once explosions of condemnation, were now just distant echoes, ghosts of a humiliation that would be retransmitted on every screen, printed in every newspaper. Her image, distorted by tears and fear, would be the face of cruelty, immortalized in the gallery of villains. Anonymity, her shield for so many years, lay in ruins, replaced by infamy. The lion, the image of the white lion, majestic and relentless, etched itself into her mind. Its amber eyes, once a silent judgment, were now a constant presence, a beacon of truth that illuminated every dark corner of her conscience. There was no escaping that gaze, that silent accusation that had unmasked her before the world. It had not attacked her with claws, but with its mere existence, with the force of its presence that unraveled her meticulous plan like a sandcastle. As the patrol van drove away, the illuminated highway, the stage of her crime and her miracle, receded in the rearview mirror. The stopped cars, the flashing lights, the journalists running back and forth, everything became a blur, a distant yet indelible memory. Her meticulously orchestrated plan collapsed before the most improbable of interventions. She had underestimated the power of life, her mother's resilience, and the incalculable force of nature. In the ambulance, her mother was wrapped in thermal blankets, her fragile body still trembling from cold and shock. The paramedics worked with silent urgency, monitoring her vital signs, administering IV fluids. Her eyes, previously fixed on the face of the daughter who abandoned her, now wandered to the vehicle's ceiling, processing the sequence of events with painful slowness. The physical pain was intense, but the pain of betrayal was an even deeper wound, a wound in the soul that might never heal. The lion, the white beast, was the last image she had of the highway, a wild angel that had refused to let her die. Arthur and the sergeant remained on the highway, watching the scene dismantle. The lion had completely disappeared into the darkness of the woods, leaving behind only mystery and the reverberation of its intervention. The air, previously heavy with tension, now carried the smell of ozone and the promise of a story that would defy logic. "I've never seen anything like it," Arthur finally managed to say, his voice still a whisper of awe. An animal, a lion, acting as a guardian. The sergeant shook his head, his eyes fixed on the spot where the white silhouette had dissolved. "Nature has its own laws, Arthur, and sometimes it reminds us that there are forces greater than our own." He paused, then continued, his voice grave. "This case, it's going to be hell. The media will go crazy. A daughter trying to kill her mother, an albino lion intervening. It's legend material." And he was right. The first news stories were already popping up on social media. Fragmented reports of a lion that stopped traffic, of a woman rescued from the brink of death. But the truth, the complete truth, was about to explode. The headlines she knew were already being rewritten. It would no longer be the story of the lion that stopped traffic, but the story of the daughter who abandoned her mother and of the beast that prevented the crime. At the police station, the daughter was taken to a cold and impersonal room. The handcuffs were removed, but the feeling of imprisonment remained. The interrogation would begin shortly. Questions would invade her mind, unraveling every layer of her plan, every distorted justification. She tried to compose herself, but the tremor in her hands and the dampness in her eyes betrayed her. She was a criminal, exposed, unmasked. Guilt, once a whisper, was now a deafening roar in her ears. an echo of the lion's silence, which remained in her mind, a white sentinel of truth, a constant reminder that even in the deepest darkness, the light of justice can emerge from the most unexpected places. And she, the daughter, was alone in her darkness, feeling the weight of every gaze, every flash, every silent roar of the lion in her ears. The end she had planned, had been rewritten by a beast and by her own darkness, and the next chapter would be written in the courts of law and conscience, under the relentless scrutiny of a world that would not forgive. The interrogation room was a concrete cube, devoid of windows, a place where time seemed to distort. The fluorescent light, cold and merciless, exposed every imperfection, every line of fatigue on her face, every trace of despair. Before her, a metal table, cold as her new reality, and a chair that seemed designed to amplify discomfort. She swallowed hard, the knot in her throat tighter than the handcuffs that had been removed. The door opened, and two detectives entered, their expressions neutral, but their eyes, she felt, already carried the world's judgment. The first, a middle-aged man with a grizzled mustache, sat opposite her. The second, younger and with a penetrating gaze, positioned himself to the side with a notepad and pen. The silence that followed was more torturous than any scream, a prelude to the approaching storm. The older detective's voice, when it finally broke the silence, was calm, but laden with unquestionable authority. "Ma'am, let's begin. Please tell us what happened tonight." The words were simple, but their weight was overwhelming. How to explain the inexplicable? How to justify the unjustifiable? The image of the white lion, with its amber eyes, danced in her mind, a silent and irrefutable witness. Every detail of her plan, once so perfect in her sick mind, now disintegrated under the raw light of truth. She tried to speak, but her voice failed, a hoarse whisper that could barely be heard. Tears, which she had tried to suppress, streamed down her cheeks, a salty river of remorse and panic. Meanwhile, outside, the world exploded. The first reports, based on amateur videos and shocked witness accounts, were already circulating. "The Miracle Highway Lion" was the headline on every news portal. But as the police confirmed the identity of the rescued woman and the arrested woman, the narrative transformed into something much darker. The story of a daughter who tried to murder her own mother, abandoning her to the brink of death, and of an albino lion that somehow intervened to prevent the crime. Social media seethed with indignation. "Monster!" "Devil!" "Unimaginable cruelty" were the mildest terms used to describe her. Her photo, captured at the moment of arrest, her face disfigured by tears and shame, went viral. She was the personification of evil, a symbol of human depravity, and the lion, in contrast, was elevated to an almost mythical status, a guardian of morality, a herald of divine justice. At the hospital, the mother, still weak and sedated, began to emerge from the fog of unconsciousness. Physical pain was a constant reminder of her ordeal, but emotional pain was the most searing. The few words she managed to articulate to the nurses and doctor confirmed the most terrible version of events. Her daughter's betrayal was a blow that left her breathless, more than any injury. But amidst the horror, there was the image of the lion, a surreal vision that refused to disappear, a white beacon in the darkness, a miracle that had pulled her back from the abyss. She didn't understand, but she knew she owed her life to that majestic creature. Arthur and the sergeant, exhausted but with a strange sense of witnessing something grand, watched the highway gradually being cleared. The lion had left no traces, only the legend that was already beginning to spread. Searching for it would be futile, they knew. It had fulfilled its purpose and disappeared, returning to the mystery from which it came. But its intervention had changed everything. The case, as the sergeant had predicted, would be a media circus, a test for the judicial system and for human belief in the inexplicable. In that cold room under the relentless light, the daughter tried to piece together her defense, but every word seemed like another brick in her own prison. The lion, invisible yet omnipresent, was her fiercest accuser. Its amber eyes, which she desperately tried to erase from her mind, were the mirror of her soul, reflecting the darkness she had tried to hide. She was alone, completely alone, before the law of men and the law of nature, both relentless in their judgment. The silent roar of the lion reverberated in her conscience, an eternal reminder that there is no darkness so profound that it cannot be illuminated by the light of truth, even if that light comes in the form of a white beast. The interrogation room, a windowless concrete cube, was a purgatory of fluorescent light. Each hum from the ceiling lamp seemed to amplify the silence, making it an almost unbearable weight on the daughter's shoulders. She couldn't tear her gaze from the metal table before her, cold and impersonal, a mirror of her own desolate reality. The handcuffs had been removed, but the feeling of imprisonment was deeper, an invisible chain binding her to her own conscience. The older detective, with his grizzled mustache, watched her with a calm that seemed cruel. His voice, when it finally filled the space, was a steel thread, smooth but unbreakable. "Ma'am, let's begin. Please tell us what happened tonight." The words were simple, but the universe of guilt they evoked was overwhelming. How could she, a woman who had planned her own mother's death, articulate the truth without drowning in her own depravity? The image of the white lion, majestic and relentless, danced in her mind, its amber eyes a silent judgment, an irrefutable witness to her monstrosity. It needed no voice. Its presence alone was enough to unmask every lie, every distorted justification she tried to construct. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry, a tight knot that prevented any sound. Her voice failed, a hoarse whisper that could barely be heard, a lament that was lost in the heavy air of the room. Tears, which she had tried to suppress with all her might, streamed down her cheeks, a salty river of remorse and panic. They were not tears of innocence, but of a guilt so profound that it drowned her. Meanwhile, outside, the world exploded. The story of the miracle highway lion was the headline on every news portal, a viral phenomenon fueled by amateur videos and shocked accounts. But, as the police confirmed the identity of the rescued woman and the arrested woman, the narrative transformed into something much darker, more visceral. It was no longer the story of a miracle, but of an abomination. Monster, devil, unimaginable cruelty. The terms popped up on social media, each more virulent than the last. Her photo, captured at the moment of arrest, her face disfigured by tears and shame, went viral, the personification of evil, a symbol of human depravity. Her life, once a shield of anonymity, was now exposed, every detail of her existence dissected and condemned by millions of strangers. And the lion, in contrast, was elevated to an almost mythical status, a guardian of morality, a herald of divine justice, a creature that defied logic and science to protect a life. Back in the cold room, under the relentless light, the daughter tried to piece together her defense, but every word seemed like another brick in her own prison. The younger detective, with his penetrating gaze, flipped through his notepad, noting every sigh, every tear. "Ma'am, your mother confirmed the facts to us. She said you left her caught on the fence, her body on the road. What is your version?" Her voice finally came out, a thin, almost inaudible thread. I didn't mean to. I was desperate." The words were a tangle of empty justifications, of a desperation that could not justify the cruelty. The lion, invisible yet omnipresent, was her fiercest accuser. Its amber eyes, which she desperately tried to erase from her mind, were the mirror of her soul, reflecting the darkness she had tried to hide. She was alone, completely alone, before the law of men and the law of nature, both relentless in their judgment. The silent roar of the lion reverberated in her conscience, an eternal reminder that there is no darkness so profound that it cannot be illuminated by the light of truth, even if that light comes in the form of a white beast. The tension in the room was palpable, each second an eternity. She knew she was lost, not just to the law, but to herself. The lion had torn the veil of her hypocrisy, exposing the naked and raw truth of her heart, and there was no escaping that gaze, that silent roar echoing in her soul, and there was no escaping that gaze, that silent roar echoing in her soul. The daughter, huddled in the metal chair, felt the air in the interrogation room grow dense, almost solid, crushing her. The older detective, with the patience of a predator, repeated the question, his voice a sharp scalpel cutting through the silence. "Ma'am, your mother confirmed the facts to us. She said you left her caught on the fence, her body on the road. What is your version?" The truth, previously a monster hidden in the depths of her mind, now rose, gigantic and undeniable. She tried to stammer another excuse, a desperate attempt to weave a web of lies. But the words dissolved in her throat, turning into a bitter taste of ashes. The white lion, with its amber eyes, was not physically there, but its presence was more real than the concrete walls. It was he who accused her, who stripped her bare, who forced her to face the abomination she had become. A sob erupted from her chest, a guttural and animalistic sound, laden with a pain that went beyond remorse. It was the sound of a soul shattering. Tears, previously a river, were now a deluge, washing away blurred makeup, revealing pale skin marked by the night of horror. I didn't mean to. I was desperate. She managed to whisper again, but this time the phrase was not a justification but a lament, the implicit confession of a lost soul. The younger detective, who until then had only been taking notes, looked up. "Desperate for what, ma'am? To get rid of your mother? To inherit what she had?" The questions were like hammer blows, each one breaking another piece of her resistance. The image of the lion, which she tried to erase, now fixed itself in her mind, a relentless beacon illuminating every dark corner of her intention. It was incarnate truth, the guardian who had refused to allow darkness to prevail. Outside, the world did not wait. The story of the miracle highway lion had transcended headlines, becoming a global phenomenon. Grainy yet shocking videos of the albino lion blocking trucks were played millions of times, subtitled in dozens of languages. But as the identities of the daughter and mother were confirmed, the narrative transformed into something even more disturbing. Miracle and monstrosity walked hand in hand. Social media seethed with collective fury. Heartless monster, devil in human skin, unimaginable cruelty were the mildest terms. Her photo, her face disfigured by tears and shame, became the face of evil, a symbol of human depravity. Her life, once an anonymous existence, was now exposed. Every detail of her story dissected and condemned by millions of strangers, not only by law, but by universal morality. At the hospital, the mother, though still weak, felt life slowly return to her body. Each breath was a reminder of the pain, but also of the miracle. Her daughter's betrayal was a wound that would never heal, a black hole in her heart. But amidst this searing pain, the image of the white lion persisted. It was not a dream, not a hallucination. It was the reality of a majestic creature that had interposed itself between her and death. She didn't understand, but she knew she owed her life to that beast, a four-legged angel that had defied all laws of nature to save her. Arthur and the sergeant, watching the highway finally being cleared, felt the weight of that extraordinary event. The lion had left no traces, only the legend that was already spreading like wildfire. Searching for it would be futile, they knew. It had fulfilled its purpose and disappeared, returning to the mystery from which it came, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and a story that defied logic. The case, as the sergeant had predicted, would be a media circus, a test for the judicial system and for human belief in the inexplicable. How to judge a crime where divine intervention, or something very close to it, had occurred? The daughter, in her cold cell, tried to piece together her defense, but every word seemed like another brick in her own prison. The lion, invisible yet omnipresent, was her fiercest accuser. Its amber eyes, which she desperately tried to erase from her mind, were the mirror of her soul, reflecting the darkness she had tried to hide. She was alone, completely alone, before the law of men and the law of nature, both relentless in their judgment. The silent roar of the lion reverberated in her conscience, an eternal reminder that there is no darkness so profound that it cannot be illuminated by the light of truth, even if that light comes in the form of a white beast. The older detective, seeing her complete collapse, knew he needed no more questions. The confession was there, in every tear, every sob, in the surrender of her spirit. The albino lion, the unexpected guardian, had done more than save a life. It had unmasked a soul, revealing humanity's darkest face and, at the same time, the hope of a miracle. The daughter would be judged, condemned, and would spend the rest of her days in the shadow of her own crime, forever haunted by the amber eyes and the silent roar of that beast nature sent to prevent her cruelty. The lion, in turn, would live forever in collective memory, an eternal symbol of justice and mystery, a beacon of hope in a world that, for a brief moment, witnessed the inexplicable.